Good morning, City Church. Man, it's good to be here with you this Easter. I want to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus together. Isn't it good to be in church today? If this is your first time here, I just want to say welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. My name is Matt Williams, and I'm one of the pastors here at the City Church. And this is a great week because we're kicking off a brand new series called Supernatural. And we're going to go through all the miracles that Jesus performed, the supernatural things that he said and did as documented in the Bible. But today we're going to start with the end before we go back to the beginning. Because the end is one of the most supernatural things that happened in the Bible. Jesus rose from the dead. And so we're going to look in Matthew chapter 27. If you have your Bibles with you today, you can open them up. Maybe you have an app on your phone. Or maybe you're just going to open your phone and look at Facebook and pretend you're looking at the Bible. You laugh. You go right ahead. So as we look at Matthew chapter 27, we find Jesus really in the middle of a messed up scenario. So as we walk forward, leading up to the end of Matthew chapter 27, Judas sold him out. One of his disciples, one of his close guys in his posse, he had 12 guys that were right there with him, and one of them sold him out. He went and falsely testified against Jesus so that they would have something that they could go arrest Jesus by. And his disciples, when they come to arrest Jesus, his disciples, they run away and they hide. Jesus is having a bad day. And then Peter denies Jesus. Not once, not twice, but he denies his affiliation with Jesus 3 different times. But there was a glimmer of hope because when they drug Jesus to the governor to see, hey, what's going to happen, the governor says, I can find nothing wrong with this man. Why are you bringing him to me? He's done nothing wrong. But the crowd riots and says, crucify him, crucify him. And he's like, well, this is a Passover feast weekend, and every year I issue a pardon, and so I decide I'm going to give you an option. Do you want to have Jesus pardoned, or do you want to have Barabbas pardoned, who is a known murderer? And the crowd says, give us Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. And so he sentences him anyway. So Jesus is beaten, beyond recognition, it says. Beaten with sticks and then beaten with a whip. And not just a whip with multiple tails on it that had bits of glass and rock and other sharp, pointy objects. And they just whipped him beyond recognition. And then they march him up a hill. Jesus is marched up a hill and crucified. He's nailed to a cross, not unlike the one we see on our stage here today. And as they put a sign above his head that says, the King of the Jews, as they mock him, and they raise the cross into the air, and people are coming by or mocking him. Oh, you're the King of the Jews. Yeah, there you are, hanging on the cross. Hey, you could save other people, but you couldn't save yourself? Come on. You said that you would tear down a temple and rebuild it in 3 days, but if you're really the Son of God, come on. Jump down off that cross. Prove it to me. And as they mocked and they jeered, the nails aren't what held Jesus to that cross. It was his love for people that held Jesus to that cross. He could have climbed down off that cross if he wanted to, but for what? To prove to the handful of people, maybe the several hundred or thousand that were there mocking and jeering, he could have proven to them for a moment that he was the Son of God. But by going through with this crazy supernatural act, he has proven to the world that he is a supernatural God, that he is the Son of God. He wasn't focused on the short-term gain. He was focused on the long-term picture. There's nobody else in history who has had the impact on the world that Jesus has had. Think about it. For 2,000 years, we've been talking about Jesus. For 2,000 years, we gather in churches every week all across the world. Millions and millions of people gather and worship the name of Jesus. We see the impact that Jesus has had, not just in his time, but in our time, and all the time leading from his time to our time. Jesus is the most controversial and most impactful figure that we have ever had on this earth. So Jesus was having a bad day. He gets nailed to the cross. But up until this point in the story, everything is somewhat natural. I mean, it computes in our brain, doesn't it? Like we look at the story and we say, oh, I get it. People didn't like him. They rioted. I've seen riots. I understand riots. I understand that riots themselves aren't necessarily logical. We see that in the news today. And so I can understand and wrap my natural mind with natural logic. I can wrap that around the idea of a riot and the people chasing him down. I can wrap my mind around the jealousy that the other religious leaders had at the time of who Jesus was and his impact. I can wrap my mind around the uprising. I can wrap my mind around the logical process of what led up to the point where Jesus is being nailed to the cross. But at this point, when he's nailed to the cross, things get interesting. Things start to cross this line from natural to supernatural. They cross the line from natural to supernatural. So let me define this for you, because natural we understand, but super as a prefix means above or beyond or exceeding the limits of. So then supernatural would mean this, that it is beyond natural. It is exceeding the limits of natural. Our natural logic cannot understand a supernatural event. By pure definition, our natural logic can't do it because it is supernatural. It is beyond our logic. And when we try to look at the miracles in the life of Jesus from a natural logic perspective, we will fall short every single time. Because Jesus is bigger than our natural logic. Our finite human mind cannot grasp the totality of Jesus and the totality of God, because he is infinite while we are finite. There's a supernatural stuff happens in our lifetime all around us, actually. It actually happens in the scientific and the medical world all the time. Hear me out. There was a guy named Louis Pasteur, a French chemist, and he was in the 1800s, and he was a French guy. He was a chemist and a scientist, and he started talking about these tiny animals. And everybody in the science world was like, what do you mean tiny animals? They're tiny. You can't even see these animals. And these animals, they crawl on your skin, and they're on your face, and they're in your eyes, and they're in your spit, they're in your breath, these tiny animals. You can't see them, you can't touch them, you can't taste them. Your natural senses can't even detect these animals exist, but they're carrying disease. And the science community of the time mocked him. They laughed at him. They said, no, that's not necessarily the case. And so as he would present this stuff, the lead scientist of the time would elbow and jeer and laugh and make fun of this guy. And so he did a few things in life, and this is what happened, is that he was describing germs. As you cough, these animals would come across the air, and if you breathe them in, then you would contract the disease that this guy was giving. Their finite mind, their natural mind, their scientific box, this was outside of their logic and reasoning. They did not have a file folder in their mind to be able to categorize the information that he was presenting. And whenever we have these situations in our life, we have an option. When we get information that comes to us and it doesn't fit into our predisposed file folder system in our brain, what are we going to do with that? We really have an option of trying to shove it into an existing file folder that maybe doesn't fit. We can build a new file folder to hold that information, or we throw it out. And that's what happens when people are confronted with faith, when they're confronted with a supernatural experience and outside of their natural bounds. He went on to do a few things that changed the medical practice. He instituted the practice of sanitizing medical instruments. He actually developed vaccines for a few diseases that nobody had even developed yet. I think it was rabies and anthrax were the two that he developed vaccines for. He was ridiculed in the scientific community, but I want to tell you that you guys, every one of you, has looked at, touched, or thought about something that he developed in the last week. Pasteurized milk. Your milk is pasteurized, removed of bacteria because of the scientific breakthrough that this guy had. So while he was ridiculed in the moment, eventually the logic and the science eventually backed up what he was talking about. He was giving a supernatural type description that didn't fit into the natural mindset of what these guys were thinking. And so we're going to look at this incident where Jesus, he dies. He's buried and he rises again. And it doesn't fit in our natural box. Your natural file system may not be able to understand what happened. And so we pick up in verse number 45. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 45, it says, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over the land, all over the land until the 9th hour." How do you explain darkness for 3 hours? I mean, it must have been a miracle. No, it was a solar eclipse. That's what it was. It was a solar eclipse. Solar eclipses don't last 3 hours of darkness. In fact, the darkness is mere minutes, not hours. And even beyond that, it would be physically impossible for that to happen because they were celebrating the Passover feast, which was held on a lunar cycle of the full moon. So the moon was in a full moon state when the darkness happened. What further explanation could you possibly have? Oh, it was just dark storm clouds that came. It was just, the sun didn't shut off, the light didn't stop, it wasn't blotted, it was dark clouds, it was a storm, that's what it was. It was a storm. But you know, there's some historians of the time that were not related to Jesus, that were not Christians, that were documenting things. In fact, there was one in Egypt that said that, he said that either the deity himself suffers in this moment or sympathizes with one who does. Because where he was at, he saw the darkness. And Phlegon said, there was darkness at noon so that the stars appeared in the heavens. You don't see the stars when the clouds are covering the sky. There's not a file folder that naturally we can think of to fit this experience in. It was a supernatural experience. As Jesus hung on the cross, God himself blocked out the sun. And in verse 46, at about that 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, oh, this man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave it up for him to drink. But the others said, wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And he died. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. Tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. So a curtain rips, the ground shakes, a rock splits, and we have zombies. Now, big deal. A curtain rips. I don't understand. Listen, this isn't your grandmother's curtain. This isn't the curtain that's hanging over your kitchen sink, you know, the window of your kitchen sink as you look into the thing. This isn't lace and doilies. This is like a huge, massive curtain. They say that it was 60 feet wide. 60 feet wide. That's a little more than half the width of this room. It was 30 feet tall. These ceilings are about 20 feet tall. And it was 4 inches thick. I'd like to see someone here rip that curtain. I don't think you could do it. You know, they say that it wasn't frayed from the bottom to the top. It was torn from the top to the bottom. Human hands don't reach top of that thing and tear it down. Only the hands of God could reach down and tear that curtain in two. And so what's the big deal? I mean, it's just a curtain, right? It's just a curtain. This curtain was so big, it took 300 men to lift it. 300 men to lift this curtain. See, the curtain represented the separation between man and the presence of God. In the temple, this curtain was the dividing line. There was an ark of the covenant that held the presence of God, there was a curtain, and then on the other side of the curtain is where the priesthood and the other people could be. And once a year, the high priest could go on the other side of that curtain, and he would make atonement. He would bridge the gap. He would make restitution for the sin of the people once a year. He was allowed to go on the other side of that curtain, and only him. If the wrong person went back, they died. You know, it's interesting that while this feast is going on, the temple would have been packed. It's not like it happened in the middle of the night and they're not sure wait, in the middle of the night, some people snuck in. They set up ladders and scaffolding, they tore it in half, and then they snuck out. It happened in the middle of the day. It'd be like it happening right now. People are gathered in the temple at this time. It wasn't a sneak in, sneak out job. It was thousands of people packed all over the place in the temple when this incident happened. So the separation between man and the presence of God was ripped in two at the moment that Jesus died on the cross. The torn curtain demonstrates that God's presence is now open for all. Rather than once a year having to pay the price, they would sacrifice animals. They would do these things. Rather than once a year sacrificing an animal and one person goes in between me and God behind a curtain into this area that I've never been before to take care of paying the penalty for my sins, God said, not anymore. The penalty is paid, not for today, not for tomorrow, but for all time, from the beginning to the end. He paid the penalty, and to show that he paid the penalty, God himself ripped the curtain in half and said that Jesus paid the penalty for all of our sins against God. It wasn't just a curtain. And the earth quaked, and rocks split, and tombs opened, and people came out. People were raised from the dead. It's pretty amazing. And in verse 54, so Matthew 27, verse 54, when the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Even the non-religious people who didn't believe in any of this stuff, in that moment, the signs were so strong. He didn't even know about the temple tearing. He saw the darkness and the earthquake, and he said, "I know this must be the Son of God." So the leaders of the time, they remembered that Jesus had said before he died, he said, "I will die and I will rise again in 3 days. I will rise from the dead in 3 days." And so the leaders are saying, okay, we got to make sure that that doesn't happen. I don't know how they're planning on stopping it, but this is what they did. They said, let's go. So they went and got a group of soldiers, not one, not two. Estimates are between 6 and 12 soldiers to go and make sure that the tomb was secure, to make sure that nobody came and stole Jesus' body, to make sure that nobody tried to pull some kind of elaborate hoax. So you could imagine, have you ever been around a group of soldiers that get assigned to do something that they think is dumb? Or how about just at your job, a group of coworkers, and you think, this is the dumbest thing my boss has ever told me to do. And you and your coworkers, you kind of start maybe talking a little smack and this is dumb. I really got to watch a dead guy and make sure he doesn't get up. Don't you understand what's happened here? So they go, and I imagine there's some grumbling and complaining along the way. But these soldiers, as they arrive, I bet the first duty that they had was to make sure the body was still there. If you're going to guard and make sure the body doesn't go anywhere, they're going to show up and say, okay, yes, the body is there. You see, the day before was the day of preparation. They were wrapping the body up and doing the burial ceremony stuff. And in that process, they would have put Jesus' hands on his chest. They would have put his ankles together, and they would have taken a burial cloth similar to an ace bandage, if you will. And they would have wrapped him up from head to toe, and they would have had a separate covering over his face, and then they would have laid him in the tomb, and then they would have put spices and stuff on top of him to help subdue the smell. And they say it's about 70 pounds of spices that they would put on top of this body. So Jesus is there. I know, I think they stink. And so they got 70 pounds of spices on top of him. He's bound up inside of there. And so the soldiers, I imagine they go, they look, they probably peek under the hood. Yep, it's him. They come back out. They roll the stone into place. Now, this is a stone. This is a massive, massive stone. Weighed 2 tons. 2 tons. 2-ton stone. And what they would do is they would actually put the stone into like a wedge. So they would set it up on this flat part, and they would roll it, and it would actually roll down a little bit into kind of a V thing, so that it kind of got stuck right there. So I'd imagine the soldiers pushing a 2-ton stone downhill would be fairly easy, but to move a 2-ton stone uphill would be even harder. And so they put a wax seal on the stone, between the stone and the tomb itself. They put a seal on there, a wax seal, so that if it got moved, they would see that it was broken. So they put a wax seal. They posted a sign. They say, no trespassing. Nobody's to touch this. Nobody's to move this. And they do the whole process. As we pick up in Matthew chapter 28, it says, now, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, how would you like to be known as, like, the other Mary? Went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. Now, I don't know if he's so big that he's like, sitting on it, or if he's like a normal size human angel with super strength to move the stone, and he's like crawled up onto it. I don't know how that, I don't know. I have like both sides in my mind. One day I'll make a movie, and then you'll know it's true. And so he rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. Have you ever scared anybody so much that they passed out? So I went on YouTube because I wanted to see. So, because that's what we do, right? We go Google it. So I go to YouTube and I said, scared, passed out, and watch videos of how they would scare somebody, and every time they go, ah, and they twitch, and then they just boom, and they fall out. And then, of course, the person who scares them thinks that they scared them to death. And they're like, wake up. And then, of course, there's, all kinds of language that I couldn't play here. So they go, because they're freaking out that they killed somebody. And so it's hilarious. And so these guys actually got scared to the point of passing out. Scared so badly that they fainted. Listen, they didn't fall asleep on the job. And here's how I know they didn't fall asleep on the job. Because in the Roman soldiers, if you fell asleep on the job, if you got posted in overnight and you took a little snooze and they caught you, they would take you in front of all your buddies, they would strip you naked, and they would burn you alive in front of all of your fellow soldiers. There was some motivation there to not fall asleep on the job. I would be motivated. I think you'd be motivated. There's motivation there. They're not going to fall asleep on the job. There's a whole group of them, the whole group of buddies there they're all soldiers. I'm sure they're kind of like, hey, stay awake. Maybe they took shifts. I don't know. They had it worked out. I can guarantee you that nobody's falling asleep on the job. And the angel comes and scares them to the point of where they freak out and pass out. And as the guards go running back into the city to say what they saw, to witness, say, oh my gosh, this just happened. The priests, the religious leaders of the time, they said, no, it can't be. They had to bribe the guards. They said, listen, here's the deal. Here's $100, or whatever it was. Here's $100. Here's 1,000 shekels, whatever they had. And here's 1,000 shekels. Listen, here's your story, and you're going to stick to it, and we're going to stick to it. You fell asleep on the job, and the disciples came and stole the body. No, I'm not going to say that story. right? Like how much money do they have to pay these guys to say this story? When they know the penalty for admitting that that's what they did would have been burned alive. And the priest says, hey, listen, I'll help keep you out of trouble. I'll go to the governor and I'll make sure that you don't get burned alive. You don't get in trouble for what happened here. Over the next few days, Jesus would appear to many people. Sometimes in groups of 2 or 3 or 4. Sometimes in groups of 20 or 30. We see in another gospel the story of how Jesus shows up to them in this room, and the disciples are huddled around, and they're kind of terrified and they're scared. They've heard the news that Jesus has risen from the dead, but they don't know what happened. They're like, well, wait, did he really rise from the dead? Or did somebody else steal the body? What's happening? And they're all huddled around, and Jesus, shows up in the room and says, peace be with you, which is probably the equivalent of boo. And, dudes like to mess with each other. Guys, you know this. We like to mess with each other. And so I'm sure that Jesus was just coming and going, boo, and they were like, holy cow, he's alive. And he's appearing to people as they're walking down the road, he comes walking alongside them. And he hangs out with them for a while. He hangs out. He sees the fishermen out fishing, and he says, cast your net on the other side. And they realize, oh my goodness, this is Jesus. And they come rowing back to shore. In fact, one of them doesn't even do that. He just jumps out of the boat and swims. And Jesus cooks them breakfast on the beach. He appears to dozens of people, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in medium groups. And at one point, he appeared to a group of over 500 people. And Paul says, you have questions about that? I've got 500 names and numbers. You can contact him right now and get an eyewitness testimony of 500 people. Oh, they were just hallucinating. My natural box says it was just a hallucination. That doesn't fit into my natural thinking. But I'm telling you that the supernatural doesn't fit in your natural thinking. 500 people had the same hallucination at the same time? That's almost more unlikely than him coming back from the dead. That's 500 miracles instead of one. I'm just saying, like, what happened in Jesus' life, this season of what happened here when Jesus dies and is buried and rose again, doesn't fit into natural thinking. So did God intervene in human history? If the band could come, we're going to wrap up right now. I'm going to get you out of here early on Easter. How about that? Did God intervene in human history? What if God really did this? What if he died for our sins? Where do we file this information? Ultimately, you have to decide for yourself, is this true or is this not true? What if these things are true? Do we need a new cognitive category to understand what happened? The supernatural experience that happened that day. I can't wrap my natural mind around it. I can't explain how the sun blacked out. I can't explain to you how the curtain tore from top to bottom. I can't explain to you how an angel showed up. I can't explain to you how a 2-ton stone got moved uphill. I mean, did Jesus faint? Maybe he just got tired of being on the cross and fainted. They actually, to make sure he was dead, they took a spear and they stabbed him with it through his side into his heart to make sure that he was dead. So let's just say, hypothetically, that even that didn't get him. He just fainted and he was weak. And they put him into a tomb. And then what? He woke up one day and, with his fingertips from inside the tomb, broke the wax seal and moved the 2-ton stone uphill and snuck out. There's not a logical category to where you can file this stuff in. I tell you, there's only one thing. It is a supernatural experience. It is a miracle orchestrated by God himself. And when Jesus died on the cross and he was dead for 3 days, the Bible says that he went down to hell. He took the keys of death from Satan himself. He brought death to death. And then he came back to life, and he brings life to life. Jesus is here, and he's alive today. You see, if this is true, you cannot be passive with this information. This truth requires action. This truth requires action. So what will you do with what Jesus has done? Do you take the information and say, nah, and chuck it? Do you try to make logical explanation of what happened in a super logical miracle? Or are you willing to open your heart and say, yeah, I choose to believe that God sent his son down to earth to pay the price for my sin so that I could have access to the Father directly. When the veil was told, I choose to believe that when the veil was torn, I have now gained direct access to God. I don't have to go through an intermediary person. I don't have to go through a pastor or a priest. I don't have to pray to anyone else other than to Jesus Christ himself, the Son of God. I choose to believe. And for many of you in the room, you've already chosen to believe this. And for this day, it's a reminder and a celebration of, yeah, my God did it. He tore the veil. He took death to death, and he brought life to life. But there may be somebody here in the room today that you say, you know, I've never made that declaration of faith. I've never said, yeah, I believe that this was a supernatural experience. I believe that God sent his son to earth to die, and he rose again. I'm going to give you an opportunity to make that declaration today. And I want you to know that it's not a lighthearted declaration. It's not a, oh yeah, I guess that could be true. Sure. No, the implications of saying that you believe this are massive. It means that the power of Jesus Christ comes to live inside of you. It says that the same power that conquered the grave lives in you. It means God can bring death to the things that are death in your life. And God can breathe life onto the things that are life in your life. It won't be easy, this Christian walk. But I can tell you, knowing your Creator on this level, there is nothing more satisfying in life. Opening that filing cabinet and saying, yes, I believe, is the best decision you can ever make. You get the opportunity to have a conversation with God himself. And so with every head bowed and every eye closed, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm not trying to call you out. All I'm saying is if that's where you're at and you say, today is the day I'm going to make that statement of faith, I'm going to make that declaration and say, yes, I believe. If that's you, would you put your hand up right where you're at?